Okay, so we'll start with the first question. Get things rolling. What are you researching at the moment?
Okay, so right now I'm working on an edited volume that's provisionally entitled Screens and Scenes, having to do, and I'll have to explain that because it's not obvious, but it's on video conferencing, and it's about, the subtitle has to do with intercultural encounters in a globalized world, and how video conferencing is becoming now very common in both personal and professional communication. But there's a lot that we don't really understand about what happens in the mediation process through video conferencing. So what we're doing is we have a collection of studies that bring together researchers from Europe, the US, and Australia to look at different situations in which people are talking with one another in intercultural situations that is mediated by video conferencing. So the screens and scenes has to do with the physical screen, which mediates the communication, and the scenes has to do with the mental representations that people develop that are based on what they've seen and heard through the screen. And as we all know, sometimes the mental representations that get developed are skewed or elaborated in ways that the other person might think is not very accurate, and so forth. And so we're interested in looking at what actually happens on the screen in relation to what's happening in the room, because in some of our past research we've found when we take video in rooms, so such as this video right here, if we were interacting on screen, we would see some people on the other side, but those people would not see everything that's going on. They may not see Agnes over there, in the corner taking pictures. There might be other people around that they're not aware of, and all those things influence what we're doing in this room, but those people aren't aware of it. And so we found that sometimes, people who were interacting would be actually communicating, not verbally, but they'd be communicating with body language or glances or expressions that were not intended for the people on screen, and yet they got picked up by the people on screen as being intended for them, which is the natural thing. And so then you get misunderstandings developing. Well, why did they give us that expression when we were trying to be very serious about something and they gave us an expression that made it sound like they were mocking us or something? And so you get hard feelings established and so forth. So we're interested in looking at that in a wide variety of settings. So this is sort of an edited volume that we're working on right now.
In which languages do these interactions take place?
A lot of them are in French, just because that's, I've been involved in a video conferencing project for 8 or 9 years now. My colleague Christine Devlotte is going to be co-editing this with me. So we have a lot of people from France who are working on this, but it's going to involve English, Russian, French. I'm trying to think of 30 other languages involved. The English and Russian is kind of interesting because it's a woman who is Russian who teaches English to Russian speakers, but she hires Filipinos and among other groups to do the teaching. So it very quickly becomes very intercultural.
Yes, multicultural, yes.
And this has to do with, the market conditions of globalization, because she can't afford to hire, say, Australians. She's living in Australia. She can't afford to hire Australians or Brits or Americans to do this online teaching because they'd be too expensive for her business. So she outsources this to other groups that speak English. But it creates an interesting mix.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Yeah. So anyway, that's one of the chapters that's going to be sort of dealing with, you know, the business side of international language, and how video conferencing is a very integral part of that effort.
Okay, super interesting. So it's like you're sharing the same environment, but being affected differently by what's around you. In a sense.
Well, the thing is that when you're interacting with somebody online, you often feel like you're right there. You know, it's face to face, sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
You know, you feel it's just transparent. You're seeing them, you're hearing them, they're seeing you, but there are little things that are quite different. You know, so for example, as we all know, you know, there's no real eye-to-eye contact. You know, when I look at, if you were on screen, Patrick, I would be looking at the screen.
Generally.
But to your, you know, because the webcam's up there, it would seem like I'm looking down like this when I'm talking to you. And so every time, you know, that we look at one another, you know, it's looking like this. But whereas if I look at like this, I'm actually not seeing you. When you see my eyes looking at you, because I could look at the webcam to make, and this is what we've found with our exchanges, that sometimes our tutors in France will look at the webcam in order to create the impression that they are making eye-to-eye contact with their students in Berkeley. But as a result, they don't see the students in Berkeley. And so if the Berkeley students, you know, make a gesture or a facial expression, they're not really picking it up. But they are going out of their way to create that impression of eye-to-eye contact.
Wow,
So,
that's super interesting. We don't consider these things, you know, that deep when we're actually in the environment ourselves. It's great.
And all kinds of other things, you know, like, so for example, in our exchanges we've had students who are there, you know, in the lab ready to connect, but for some reason there's been some sort of technological glitch and, you know, their machine has not been working. And so the other people are waiting, you know, impatiently, you know, and you know, watching their clock, and they're saying, you know, these Californian students, they just, you know, they're not taking this seriously, blah, blah, blah. And so then they finally get connected and they say, sorry for the delay, you know, we had a technical problem, but the French people, in this particular case, persisted in believing that the students had actually shown up late. And that's because the others who, their comrades in the lab in France, all had connected with their other students, so they figured, you know, what can go wrong? You know, everyone else is connected except for us, and our students just didn't show up. So even though they had an explanation that their computer had a problem, they persisted in their belief that these students had not taken this very seriously and shown up late for their meeting.
Do you find that certain technology is more effective than others, so to prevent these kinds of glitches? Are there particular
Well, I mean,
things that you use to...
every form of mediation has its effects. So, you know, and even in a space like this, our communication is mediated. So for example, if this were nighttime and all of a sudden the lights went out, we would not be able to see one another, and that's going to have an effect on our, so we're being mediated by light, by air, you know, and of course, as you modify these conditions, it has an effect. So even face-to-face communication is going to be affected by changing conditions. I think the same thing with digital technologies. Every time you move to a different type of mediation, there are going to be consequences for communication. And this is one of the things that I was looking at, so for example, the last couple of years when I've taught this, it's basically an undergraduate, it's called French for Future Teachers of the Language, and it's a French class, but it's basically, you know, second language acquisition, and so we did the last 2 times I taught this course, we were working in tandem with students at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, and we had video conferencing. Well, I should back up. We staged it, and so they had different ways of interacting with one another. We culminated in video conferencing, but we started with forum postings where they would introduce themselves. Hi, my name is Rick, I'm a student, blah, 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 blah. And so then they would respond to one another's postings about who they were, introduce themselves, get to know each other through these forums. And then from that, we moved to chat rooms, which was radically different in terms of the kinds of things that they said. That's one of the interesting things. As you change medium, you find that it's not just the language use, but also the kinds of things that they talk about. So the forum was very formal, and the chat was extremely informal. And there was no, it's not that they knew each other so well by then, that it was just by virtue of being chat and very, interactive and having to write short messages and so forth. But what was interesting about that is that in one case that I can think of, my American students had thought that their interlocutor was a man. And then it wasn't until they got on video conferencing that all of a sudden this person was a woman. And so that radically changed how they had interpreted a lot of the previous communication that they had had, things that they were wondering about and so forth. So, what information you get from different channels, auditory, visual, and so forth, all plays a big role. So we went from forums to chat to email to then two different types of video conferencing. One was Skype and the other was a program that was developed in Lyon for this particular research project, which is a very different interface from Skype. And so we were looking at what kinds of effects each of these mediums had on the kinds of communication. And that's what sort of led up to this scenes and screens, because we realized that people get ideas based on what they have available to them, which is a perfectly normal human thing. But when you're talking about the complexities of intercultural communication, sometimes this filtering of what you have access to can actually produce some consequential results. So anyway, that's what we're working on in the next project.
Great,
Yeah.
great. Okay, could you share with us a bit more about relational pedagogy and the role it plays in classroom culture?
Well, I'm not sure what role it does play in the classroom culture right now. But so the idea behind relational pedagogy, okay, so basically language tends to get taught in terms of things. So you learn vocabulary, you learn morphology, you learn syntax, you learn pragmatic rules, and you learn some culture. And all these are sort of, tend to be a little bit compartmentalized, and the idea is you learn this body of stuff. You study your vocabulary lists, you study your grammar, you look at the morphological endings, and you learn how to do imparfait, passé composé, and so on and so forth. And which I have no issue with that. I mean, you have to learn all this stuff. But what I'm trying to get at with the name of relational pedagogy is that so much of meaning making is not in the things themselves, but actually in the invisible relations between things. So it's not the fact just that you've used this morphological ending, but it's the fact that this morphological ending is used with this particular word in this particular syntax in this pragmatic situation that it has this particular meaning. Because as we all know, any morphological structure is going to have or a lexical item for that matter, is going to have different meanings or connotations depending on how it's used. And so the idea is to try and get a little bit more of a grip on that, how it's used, rather than the emphasis being on the thing itself. So later on today, I'll give some examples of things that ostensibly mean one thing, but in this particular use might mean something radically different. And so the point of this is to sort of get learners consciously aware of the extent to which language is contingent on lots of things. And mastery of the things of language doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to fully function in the language without consciousness of some of these other dimensions.
And so you're suggesting that language pedagogy should perhaps adapt to take this into account?
Yeah, so, yeah, basically, it's, instead of looking at the, if you look, sort of have a biological analog, I mean, instead of looking at just the organism and its anatomy and physiology, you're looking at the ecology in which that organism lives, to understand how it has adapted to take on that form and physiology over millennia, so that you have a sense of how this is actually operating in a more ecological sense. Because we don't use language in any way other than a kind of ecological, social way. Even when we're using it for thought in our mind, there's still a social basis for it. So anyway, that's the emphasis is on moving towards a not getting rid of the thingness, because that's, you've got to have that in order to be able to get a foothold. But that's not the be-all and end-all of language teaching. I guess that's the takeaway.
Nice. Okay, thank you. For second language learners, how important is cultural awareness in acquiring a new language? Do you think technology takes us away from this?
Well, cultural knowledge is huge.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, you can't get very far without cultural learning that goes along. And that's, from day one. So for example, when kids are learning French, day one, greetings. How you greet other people is so contingent on social roles and relations. Whether you use tu versus vous is a cultural phenomenon, and so you can't even get started without immediately immersing yourself in culture. So yeah, I think it's absolutely. So the second part was whether technology takes us away from that. I would say that technology immerses us in more culture, because every technology has got its own culture that develops around it, and that's another cultural layer that we have to learn how to deal with. So, I mean, just to take video conferencing, as one example, and there are certain ways that people have adapted to the constraints of video conferencing, which become socially shared, and that become sort of a norm for video conferencing, and that's a kind of technological culture, that people who are experienced in communicating by whatever means, whether it's email, texting, video conferencing, telephone, all of these things require certain adaptations in the ways we use language. And so I think one could look at that as a kind of acculturation to the medium. That there's a certain, because it's not just a hardware thing. It's how we adapt individually, socially, and culturally to these new devices that we have. And we understand that there's certain things that you do and that you don't do. That's culture, you know. Certain ways of using language that we consider appropriate or inappropriate, that's cultural. And so it's kind of a hybrid techno-culture that I think evolves around any new technology. So I would say that technology doesn't take us away from that, but it complicates things in that it creates new contexts of interaction that we then have to develop cultural norms around. So we're sort of adding an additional layer of culture. And you know, you can see that really simply just with, well, maybe not so much now, but I mean 10 years ago or maybe longer. I mean when email, you know, students were using email with professors, there's always sort of this you know, first of all, you never know as a student whether to address your professor as dear Professor so-and-so, or their first name, or just some, you know, neutral address like hello, or I've gotten emails saying, hey, you know. So there's a whole range. And so I think people are trying out to see, because they're not really sure. The footing is not secure, and so you don't know exactly what the etiquette is in this medium. Now, the person who writes me hey in an email would not do that face-to-face.
That's very true.
But an email, because of their experience with the medium, that's the kind of address that they're used to.
Maybe the formality that they associate with emails is not as formal. Generally.
Well, that happens with, you know, when you move to chat, you know, so I've had graduate seminars, you know, that have been in chat rooms. And immediately, I mean, the discourse is radically different from what would ever happen in a face-to-face, you know, sitting around a table like this.
It's toned down.
I mean, it becomes extremely playful. People are making jokes right and left. They are punning off of one another. I mean, that would never happen sitting face-to-face, you know, in a seminar. But because you go into that mode, they have a certain associations with what happens in a chat room. And it just, the experimental nature of it brings out a whole new side of people and a whole new ways of comporting themselves socially. So it's super interesting, I think.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
For sure.
So I mean, one of the things for, you know, to go back to your, actually you haven't really asked this question, but I think it's probably one that you've got on there somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, so as far as language learning, to me, it's super interesting to get students exposed to a wide range of these environments, so that, you know, they're not just in, you know, a four-wall classroom with, you know, teacher at the front of the classroom and then sitting in their rows, always the same dynamic, but that in fact, you know, one of the nice things about technology, it shakes that up. And so when you go to a chat room and it, you know, radically changes the kind of discourse that students engage in, I think that's a good thing, you know, because it's giving them a new platform to express themselves. It's making them use language, that new language, in ways that they would not ordinarily use it, and often in very playful ways, which I think is a great thing.
Right, it's huge, and I think that comes more natural outside of the classroom.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's hard to recreate that dynamic.
Right.
Me standing in front of a classroom with students sitting in rows.
Yes.
It's very difficult. I mean, you can try to encourage you know, imagination, creativity, and so forth. And literature is a great way of doing that. But it's different from when you put them in a chat room. I mean, they just take off in ways that would be very difficult to duplicate in a more structured and face-to-face setting. Even though you're all still in the same, that's the curious thing, is it's not like the teacher is being removed from the group. You know, it's the same, often this very same room. It's just that they're on a computer now, and the teacher is right there. But for example, as a teacher, I completely lose any authority in, you know, on a chat room situation. You know, I can say, okay, now let's talk about such and such, and it's just like they go off on their thing. You know, it's just like, forget it. You know, whereas if it's a face-to-face situation, that never happens. But you get them in a chat situation, and the roles change radically. So, which is not a comfortable thing for all instructors. So that's another thing, you know, and that's a big cultural thing too. I mean, especially, you know, for some teachers, it's just not something that has any appeal whatsoever. But to me, it does.
You think that's beneficial to their?
I think so. Yeah. I think changing it up and shifting the ground on which they are communicating is it's a good thing.
I agree. You should see more of that in the classroom. Sure.
Well, especially these days, because you know the reality is that you know these students that we're teaching languages to. Many of them will not have occasion to be traveling to that part of the world and you know living in that environment, but they may, on a daily basis, be engaging with people electronically because this is becoming more and more the norm. You know, we're spending so much of our time communicating electronically with people, whether it's at home or abroad, and so I think it's important to have that part of. I mean, one of the luxuries of studying language in a university is that you get a chance to reflect on the very process of learning, and that this gives students a chance to talk about these kinds of things, about what has happened that is disconcerting or puzzling from their exchange. They can bring in a transcript of what happened in their exchange with someone, and we can talk about it in class, which is really interesting. So I think that because our students are going to be communicating at least some of the time electronically with other people in the target language, that should be part of their education too, and not just sort of finding out about that after they've graduated.
Right. Yes. Any questions? Okay. Do you believe that it could be possible that technology is hindering the learning process by adding additional elements to overcome in the classroom?
Well, similar. I mean, I would say no, because, well, first of all, depending on how you define, we don't think about this as technology, but it is. So, do I think that this is hindering, you know, what we do?
Yes.
No, I don't think it hinders.
Right.
I think that, you know, every form of technology is going to bring certain constraints with it, but it's going to also offer possibilities to us. And that's why I think the more we can sort of use a wide number of mediums, technologies, the better our students will be able to cope with the new things that we can't even imagine right now that they will be using in their personal and professional lives. So, no, I don't think it moves, that it hurts learning, because, you know, textbooks are a technology, films are a technology, paper and pencil are a technology. I think all these things are good, but that it's also good for us to understand sort of how they work together and how, you know, what those limitations are that we don't even, we often don't think of.
So understanding the constraints and using them like supplemental to each other to try to make everything come together.
I mean, so for example, you know, people think about the internet and they think, well, I don't need to go to the place because I can just, you know, I can look up, you know, Egypt on the internet and find out everything I want to know about it. And I can see all the images, I can see all the films, I can hear the sounds. I can't smell the smells, but maybe that will come with the future technology. But, you know, the idea is that, you know, I can be there while sitting in my living room.
Right.
So, you know, but there's another side, which is that, you know, the way internet technology works, you know, first of all of my clicks are somewhere, you know, being accounted for and you know, fed into a database and so forth. Advertising. So when next time I, you know, open up my Ace Hardware website, I'll see something about, you know, offering a super special to Egypt because, you know, I was looking at Egypt. So it's taking all of this into account, and they've done studies to show that actually, as people search more and more, it gets narrower and narrower and narrower in terms of the kinds of things that actually pop up on their Google search. So that the more you use the internet, everything is sort of custom tailored to your past clicking experiences. And so when I look up something on the internet, I'll actually get different results than you will based on our past internet clickings and so forth. And so I may see this as a transparent window to, you know, this other world, but it's actually very different from this transparent world that you're getting, and doubtlessly incredibly different from the real world that's out there. But I nevertheless am convinced I'm getting through, you know, the internet. So I think that, you know, there's a you know, illusory dimension to the internet that, again, I mean, there are great things about the internet, but that we have to be sort of consciously aware of the downsides too, and not let ourselves be led into the illusion that we've done it all because we've seen it on the internet.
Right.
It's been a figment of our imagination. So I guess that would be my take on that one.
Sure, thank you. I think you did answer this one, but in your book you mentioned that technology reflects a direct environment, and you said that earlier. Considering the new student experience, do you believe that incorporating technology can increase difficulty in acculturating into a new multicultural, multilingual environment? I think you did touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say yes and no, because it's adding another layer of interactional complexity. So, especially if the technology is one that's not familiar to the students, and nowadays the scene is incredibly different from when I started using technology with students back in the late 80s and early 90s. You know, there it was like you really had to introduce, you know, the computer and how you do things, and you know, and so it's a lot easier now. But there's still, so for example, when we had this interface that was developed in Lyon for our research project, we had to teach the students how to use this particular interface because it was not one that they were used to, because it's not commercially available.
Mhm.
Yes, it was for this specific project. And it had a timeline, and there were markers on there and so forth, so we had to teach the students. And that all adds, they didn't like that aspect of it. They didn't like having to learn a new interface. So I think in that sense, that was a negative side, you know, of imposing a little too much learning about the interface itself.
The actual technology.
Yeah, and our interactions always went much better with Skype.
Mhm.
Skype was simple, streamlined, they were used to it, and the interactions just went remarkably better with Skype. It wasn't as good for us because Skype is hard to use on the research side as far as getting quality recordings of sound on both sides. We were always able to record sound on one side, but then the other side would be silent. And obviously that was a huge problem for research. So from a research angle, we didn't like Skype, but from a pedagogical side, it was great.
Do you think that video conferencing, so Skype and other platforms that you could use, do you think that they increase the likelihood that there will be multilingualism among students because they have access to these technologies, so they can communicate more easily with people in other countries?
I don't know. I don't know that it would be so technologically driven. I think multilingualism is more likely to evolve from other contexts. Multilingualism, because there are lots of people who know they have access to the means with which to talk with people anywhere in the world that have access to the internet. But I don't see those people going online in droves learning languages so they can do that. I don't think that happens, you know. So I don't think that the technology is leading people to, is pulling them or making them feel like they want to become multilingual. I think for a lot of people, it's more the opposite. Now that Google Translate and everything else is out there, there's even less reason for me to learn a foreign language as far as technology goes, because at a press of a button, I can instantly hear this Arabic converted into English, and well, it's going to be approximate, but that's okay for me, as long as I get the gist of what's going on. That's good enough, better than spending years and huge amounts of effort trying to learn Arabic. If at the press of a button I can get easy translation. So I think if anything, it would be more the opposite.
More monolingualism.
Yeah, well, I don't know about, I just think that it makes a lot of people, people that I've talked to who aren't language learners, a lot of them talk about the fact that, well, why bother? Why bother these days? Because, first of all, everybody speaks English wherever you go, wherever they happen to go. Far from everywhere. But wherever they go, people are speaking English. And then, technology with all these, fancy translation programs are bringing the world to us. We don't have to go out to it. So I think that there's a lot of that attitude out there. But I think among students, I think students are just intrinsically interested in learning other languages and learning about other cultures, and they just, and the ability to use technology is a great plus, but it's not what leads them. I can't think of any students that I've talked with at Berkeley that studied languages because of technology. I don't think they're drawn to it by technology. I don't think they don't think of it as something that uses technology any more than, any of their other courses. It's just sort of there. But we don't have a language requirement. Well, we do have a language requirement, but it's one that's satisfied by our admissions requirement. So essentially, we don't have a language requirement, but we still have tons of students signing up for language classes, but not because of technology. It's because they like the learning in a face-to-face environment.
That's curiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you describe for us how your own interest in technology-mediated language learning and teaching developed? What is your history with this?
Well, in graduate school, I was always interested in computers because microcomputers this was back in the 80s, and microcomputers were the big thing. And there wasn't anything as far as language learning with computers back then, but I was interested in computers. Then when I took my first job at Austin, Texas, Jerome Bump and others in the English department, there was a student there that had developed a program called Daedalus Interchange. And this was used in, it was a sort of a rhetorical invention device that helped students with their writing by asking them lots of questions, and they would type in answers, and which then the computer would reformulate to help them focus their ideas for an essay. So it would ask all these heuristic questions, and then it would reformulate their answers, and then that was one component. Then there was the interchange component, which brought the students together in a kind of chat room environment to talk about their writing or topics, or to do role plays with, where they would take on the personas of the characters in whatever novel they were reading. So, which was a great thing because, part of the thing about doing a role play in class face to face is, we see, the same old people and dressed like, we always are, and, and especially in a foreign language, it's harder because it's hard to get out the words fast enough, fluidly enough, and so forth. But in a written situation, it's really like the novel in the sense that you envision what this person is like, and so you can role play somebody of another professional status, of another gender, of another identity, completely, and it comes across more believable in a sense because it's just through text. And you don't have the same worries about, pronunciation and, the anxieties that students have about that, so they're just typing. So this was I was super excited about this, and so I started using this Orlando Kiln, Peggy Beauvoir, who was a student of mine at University of Texas, did her dissertation on this. So she was the one who used it more than anyone in French. Orlando Kiln was doing this in Portuguese. So when I came to Berkeley, I started using this in my classes and had some good experiences with it. And then began doing email exchanges. So I remember once reading in the New York Times about this group of high school students who had just won an award that was delivered by François Mitterrand, who was then president of the Republic, and they had published these essays about immigration and how their family histories intersected with big history. And all very, they had to be 1 page long, so very concise, but super interesting. So I found out who the teacher was by writing to the Times journalist who had written the article, and her name was Sabine Contrepoix. And so I wrote to her and asked if she would be interested in doing an exchange. She said, yeah, great, you know, because I said, you know, we've got lots of, at Berkeley, we've got lots of students from all different cultural, ethnic backgrounds and so forth. This would be super interesting to sort of exchange stories. So we did that by email. Which is a great, really fun project. The students learned a lot, really enjoyed it, and got them using French with partners in France, which was super motivating for them. And then from then, a series of projects which led up to this video conferencing exchange that we've been doing with Lyon for many years now. So that's sort of a short history of. But basically, you know, I found that students were really motivated by that kind of contact. So I never used, partly because I just had never used this in my own experience as a learner, but you know, there are lots of tutorials and so forth where you can use computers to just as sort of tutors where they're teaching you the language. But I've never found anything that I found quite as motivating as a use of computer to interact with other people. That to me was always the most interesting use of computers.
And it sounds like, to me, one of the keys to this, and I've found it in things that I've done as well in partnering up students to have exchanges with others abroad, one of the keys seems to be to have an engaged and reliable partner teacher, someone with whom you can work on the other end, so you can pair the students up to get classes of students. And that's one of, I think, the most difficult things for us as instructors to set up. It's not always easy to find that partner.
You are so right about that, because if you don't have someone that you get along with, that you work well with, that is cooperative and willing to put the time into it, this could be hell.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's so true.
Are there any suggestions you can offer for how teachers?
Well, you know, there are
are
lots of online, you know, just like for online, there's online everything, you know. So one of the things is finding partner teachers. I've never used them, and I don't know how satisfactory that is. In my case, it's always been through personal connections, you know, where I've known somebody and we've talked about the possibility, we both get excited about it, and we say, let's try this out, and, you know, and it's always been really fun. But I know other people who have, you know, wrestled with that specific issue because they don't have someone that they know. You know, I think it's really important to know the other person. So that immediately makes it more complicated for the teacher to arrange. But I think that's, you know, so I think with luck, you know, these online, like online dating, you know, with luck, it'll be fantastic, you know, and with luck, finding a partner teacher to work with would be absolutely great. It's just, there's a chance that it wouldn't be so big too. Yes.
One of the projects that does this kind of, well, not partnering up, you already have to have the partner teacher, but then once you have one, there's, which you're probably familiar with, is the Kultura project
Yeah.
through MIT.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you've ever worked with that project specifically and what your experience.
Well, I've never used it myself in one of my classes, but we have used it in I supervise our conversation courses, and we've had our conversation courses do that. Although not the full-blown cultural exchange that Gilbert and Sabine, Shogi and others have done over many years. One of the things that we've done is use the archives of that, which are super interesting, and you can launch all kinds of great discussions just using the archives without having your students, do a full-blown exchange. Yeah, I'm quite familiar with it, and I've seen lots and lots of the exchanges, and I think it's great. I mean, I think that I guess the thing is you have to sort of devote your course to that, just because of the sheer amount of types of exchange. When you've got word associations, and then the culture exploration component, comparison of films and their remakes in their language. There's a whole broad structure of activities. So I think to fully take advantage of it, you would have a cultura course, which is what they do. And I've never had the luxury of being able to create, to devote a whole course to that.
We haven't either. We've done only the word association part as a
Yeah,
component.
which is a super thing. It's really interesting to see the different associations that the students come up with, and then to be able to see the dialogue around those comparisons is super interesting too. Yeah.
Was that your?
Do you have other questions?
I
for
finished
us?
up on mine. Can you finish
Do you have
yours?
any questions? Okay.
We'd like to thank you for your time. We
Okay.
appreciate it.
Hey, it was fun. Thank you for having you.
All right.
Yeah.